The divorce papers trembled in Grace's hands as she sat in her car outside the law firm, rain drumming against the windshield like a funeral march. 3 signatures. That's all that stood between her and the end of everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the woman she used to call her best friend. Her phone buzzed. A text from Walter. Victoria says you have until Friday to clear out your office. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Grace's breath caught. Even now, even after everything, he was still protecting her. Victoria Chen, the woman who had systematically dismantled Grace's life with surgical precision. First her marriage, then her career, all while wearing the mask of mentorship and friendship. Through the rain-streaked glass, Grace watched couples hurrying past under shared umbrellas, and something fierce awakened in her chest. Not the broken woman who had discovered her husband and boss tangled in Egyptian cotton sheets in the penthouse office. Not the fool who had believed Victoria's tears were genuine when she'd confessed her feelings for Walter. This was someone new. Someone who had spent 3 sleepless months planning, calculating, waiting. Grace's finger hovered over her phone screen, over the contact she'd been saving for exactly this moment. One call would change everything. One call would make Victoria Chen understand that some betrayals came with a price she never saw coming. The rain stopped. Grace smiled for the first time in months, her reflection sharp and unfamiliar in the window. What did they say about revenge? That it was a dish best served cold? She was about to find out just how cold her heart could be. Grace Morrison had always been the woman who played by the rules. At 34, she'd built her reputation as the most trusted account director at Chen Marketing Solutions through 14-hour days, weekend strategy sessions, and an unwavering belief that loyalty was rewarded. She'd met Walter at a company Christmas party 5 years ago. He was Victoria's business partner then, charming and ambitious, with laugh lines that crinkled when he talked about building something lasting. Their love had been the steady kind. Sunday morning coffee, shared Netflix passwords, and dreams of a house with a garden where Grace could grow the tomatoes Walter loved in his weekend omelets. They'd married in Victoria's backyard, under string lights and the blessing of the woman Grace considered her mentor, her friend, her chosen sister. Victoria Chen was everything Grace wasn't. Sharp where Grace was soft, calculated where Grace was intuitive. At 41, she commanded boardrooms with the precision of a surgeon and the charisma of a politician. She'd built her agency from nothing, sleeping on office couches and living on ramen until the breakthrough campaign that made her name synonymous with innovative marketing in the city. Grace had admired Victoria's strength, the way she never seemed to need anyone. What she hadn't seen was how that strength had calcified into a hunger that consumed everything in its path, including the people who loved her most. Walter Morrison was caught between 2 gravitational pulls he didn't fully understand. At 37, he'd always been the supporting player in his own life story, first to Victoria's entrepreneurial vision, then to Grace's unwavering devotion. He was the CFO who made the numbers work, the husband who remembered anniversaries, the man who fixed leaky faucets and never asked for credit. But Victoria saw something in him that Grace had stopped noticing in the comfortable rhythm of marriage: potential. Raw ambition that could be polished into something magnificent. She'd started working late with him, strategy sessions that stretched into wine-soaked conversations about expansion, about legacy, about what they could build together. The first kiss had been Victoria's idea. The affair that followed was Walter's choice. Grace's sister Maya had warned her. That woman collects people like trophies. She'd said over lunch 3 months before everything imploded. And she doesn't like to share. Grace had laughed it off then, secure in her marriage, her career, her place in Victoria's inner circle. She'd been Victoria's maid of honor in her short-lived marriage to the tech entrepreneur. She'd held Victoria's hair back when she'd cried over her divorce. She'd been the first person Victoria called when the agency landed their biggest client. She'd never imagined she was being positioned for the fall. The discovery came on a Tuesday in March, when Grace returned to the office after a client lunch to grab files she'd forgotten. The executive floor was supposed to be empty. Victoria was in meetings all afternoon. Walter was visiting his mother in Portland. But the elevator opened to reveal Victoria's assistant gone, and muffled sounds coming from behind the closed door of the corner office. Grace's hand was on the door handle before rational thought could stop her. The sight that greeted her would replay in her dreams for months. Victoria pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Walter's hands tangled in her perfectly styled hair, both of them lost in a passion Grace hadn't seen in her husband's eyes in years. Time compressed and expanded simultaneously. Grace watched for what felt like hours but must have been seconds before Victoria's eyes opened and found hers in the reflection of the glass. No shame. No surprise. Just a quiet satisfaction, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "Grace," Victoria said softly, not moving away from Walter, who spun around with genuine horror flooding his features. "We need to talk." But Grace was already backing away, the files scattered forgotten across the marble floor, her world tilting on an axis she never knew existed. She made it to the bathroom before the sobs came, violent and primal, the sound of something precious being torn apart. When she emerged 20 minutes later, red-eyed and shaking, Victoria was waiting by her desk with a cup of tea and an expression of careful concern. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," Victoria said, her voice gentle in the way Grace remembered from late nights when they'd worked on impossible deadlines together. "But maybe it's better. We've been trying to figure out how to tell you." The word hit Grace like a physical blow. "How long?" Grace's voice was barely a whisper. 6 months, Victoria said without hesitation. "Grace, you have to understand, neither of us planned this. Sometimes love just happens." Love. Grace stared at this woman she'd trusted with her secrets, her career, her husband, and realized she'd never really known her at all. The next 3 weeks passed in a haze of lawyers, mediators, and the suffocating kindness of people who didn't know what to say. Walter moved out with the efficiency of a man who'd been planning his escape longer than he cared to admit. Victoria gave Grace time to process and space to heal, all while parading Walter through the office's glass-walled conference rooms like a prize she'd won. Grace threw herself into work with desperate intensity, as if landing the perfect campaign could somehow rebuild what had been destroyed. She stayed late, arrived early, pitched ideas with the fevered creativity of someone trying to prove their worth to a universe that seemed determined to discard them. "You're scaring the interns," her colleague David mentioned one Thursday evening, finding Grace still at her desk at 9 p.m. David Martinez had been Grace's work husband long before Walter became her real one, the creative director whose irreverent humor had gotten her through impossible clients and budget cuts. At 39, he'd seen enough office politics to recognize a woman fighting for her professional life. "Victoria's been asking questions about your client relationships," he said carefully, perching on the edge of her desk. "About boundaries. Whether you're too emotionally invested to maintain objectivity." Grace looked up from the campaign mock-ups spread across her monitor. "What kind of questions?" David's expression was grim. "The kind that come before a performance review." "Grace, I've seen this before. Victoria's building a case." The realization settled over Grace like ice water. Of course. It wasn't enough to take her husband. Victoria needed to erase her entirely, to rewrite the story so that Grace became the unstable woman who couldn't handle personal rejection, whose emotional fragility made her unsuitable for high-stakes client work. "How long do I have?" Grace asked. "Maybe a month. 2 if you're lucky." That night, Grace sat in her empty house. Walter had taken everything that mattered, including the coffee maker and the framed photo from their honeymoon, and made a list. Not of what she'd lost, but of what she still had access to. Client contacts. Vendor relationships. 5 years of strategic insights about Chen Marketing Solutions processes, weaknesses, and expansion plans. And one name in her phone that she'd never thought she'd have reason to call. James Chen, Victoria's ex-husband and co-founder of the agency. The man Victoria had systematically pushed out during their divorce, who'd walked away with enough settlement money to start his own competing firm. Grace stared at his contact information until her eyes burned. James had reached out after the divorce news broke, offering support and a sympathetic ear from someone who understood Victoria's particular brand of devastation. Her finger hovered over his name for a long time before she finally pressed call. "Grace." James's voice was warm with surprise. "How are you holding up?" "I'm ready to talk," she said simply. "About Victoria. About what she's really capable of. I wondered when you'd call. Are you free for dinner tomorrow?" Grace looked around her stripped-down living room, at the spaces where Walter's presence used to be, and felt something like purpose stirring in her chest for the first time in weeks. "I'm free." James Chen was nothing like his ex-wife, which Grace realized had probably been the problem. Where Victoria was sharp angles and calculated moves, James was curves and genuine laughter. At 43, he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who'd survived his worst fears and discovered he was stronger than he'd imagined. They met at a small Italian restaurant across town, far from the upscale places where Victoria's network might spot them. Over wine and pasta, James painted a picture of his marriage that felt uncomfortably familiar. "She made me fall in love with a version of myself I'd never seen before," he said, twirling linguine around his fork with practiced ease. Victoria has this gift. She sees potential in people and reflects it back to them until they can't imagine existing without that vision. Grace nodded, remembering the early days when Victoria would praise her instincts, her creativity, her ability to read clients in ways that others missed. But the thing about Victoria is that she needs to be the source of that potential, James continued. She needs to be the reason you're special. And when you start to believe you might be special on your own. He shrugged. That's when the undermining begins. James had built Chen Marketing Solutions from a shared dream. He'd handled the creative vision while Victoria managed operations and client relationships. For 7 years, they'd been partners in every sense, until the agency's success made Victoria hungry for something bigger than shared credit. She started having private meetings with our biggest clients, James said, his voice carefully neutral, suggesting that my creative direction was becoming stale, that the agency needed fresh leadership. When I confronted her about it, she said I was being paranoid, insecure, that I was holding us back. Grace felt a chill of recognition. How many times had Victoria used similar phrases about Walter's resistance to expansion? About Grace's tendency to get too attached to client relationships? The divorce wasn't personal, James continued. It was strategic. Victoria needed me out of the business to take it in the direction she wanted. The marriage was just collateral damage. So why didn't you fight harder? Why did you let her have everything? James smiled, and Grace saw something in his expression that made her heart skip, not the broken bitterness she'd expected, but something that looked almost like freedom. Because I realized I didn't want to become the kind of person I'd have to become to beat Victoria at her own game. And because I knew that eventually, she'd overplay her hand. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. Victoria's weakness is that she can't resist total victory. She doesn't just want to win, she wants to humiliate. And that's where she makes mistakes. What kind of mistakes? The kind that leave paper trails. The kind that violate non-compete clauses and client confidentiality agreements. The kind that gives someone like you grounds for a lawsuit that could destroy everything she's built. Grace felt something shift in her chest, a puzzle piece clicking into place. You've been waiting for someone like me. I've been waiting for Victoria to give someone like you enough reason to fight back. And Grace. James reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers with surprising warmth. I've been hoping that someone would be strong enough to do what I couldn't. As they talked late into the evening, Grace found herself seeing James not as Victoria's discarded ex-husband, but as something she hadn't expected to find again, a partner. Someone who understood the particular pain of being systematically erased by someone you'd loved. Someone who looked at her not with pity, but with respect for the fire Victoria hadn't managed to extinguish. When James walked her to her car, he paused by the driver's side door. Grace, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we really go after Victoria, it's going to get ugly. She'll come after you with everything she has. Your reputation, your relationships, your financial security. She'll try to destroy you completely. Grace looked up at him, this man who'd been through Victoria's particular brand of warfare and emerged intact, and felt something like courage blooming in her chest. Then it's a good thing I don't have much left to lose. Victoria's counterattack came swiftly and with surgical precision. Grace arrived at work the following Monday to find her access badge deactivated and a security guard waiting by her desk. Ms. Morrison, I need you to come with me, the guard said quietly, drawing stares from her colleagues across the open office plan. In the conference room, Victoria sat flanked by the head of HR and a lawyer Grace didn't recognize. The woman Grace had once considered a mentor looked every inch the CEO now, power suit immaculate, expression professionally neutral, not a trace of the friend who'd cried on Grace's shoulder after her divorce. Grace, we've received some concerning information about your recent activities, Victoria began, sliding a folder across the polished table. Meetings with competitors. Discussions about proprietary client strategies. Potential violations of your confidentiality agreement. Grace opened the folder to find photos, herself and James at the restaurant, their heads close together in conversation. Phone records showing their calls. A detailed timeline of her movements over the past week. This is surveillance, Grace said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. This is due diligence, the lawyer interjected smoothly. When an employee begins engaging with direct competitors while still employed, we have a responsibility to protect our clients' interests. Furthermore, Victoria continued, her voice carrying just the right note of professional disappointment. Several colleagues have expressed concerns about your emotional stability following your personal difficulties. David Martinez reported that you've been working excessive hours, showing signs of stress that could impact client relationships. Grace felt the world tilt. David, who'd warned her about Victoria's plans. David, who she'd trusted with her fears and vulnerabilities. Another piece on Victoria's chessboard, moved into position months ago. I'm recommending immediate termination for breach of confidentiality and gross misconduct, Victoria concluded. However, given our personal history, I'm prepared to offer you a choice. Sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, accept a minimal severance package, and this ends here. Fight this, and I'll ensure you never work in marketing again. I'll make sure every agency in the city knows you're unstable, untrustworthy, and vindictive. Grace looked at the woman across from her, really looked at her, and saw Victoria clearly for the first time. Not a mentor or a friend, but a predator who'd been playing a longer game than Grace had ever imagined. The affair with Walter hadn't been about love or even desire. It had been about control. About ensuring Grace's complete destruction by taking away her marriage, her career, and her ability to fight back. I need time to consider, Grace said. Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. You have until tomorrow morning. And Grace, James Chen can't save you. He tried to play this game with me once before, and you can see how that ended. Grace walked out of the building that had been her professional home for 7 years with a box of personal items and the crushing weight of total defeat. Her phone buzzed constantly, colleagues texting their shock, Walter sending messages about handling this maturely, Maya calling with increasingly frantic voicemails. She ignored them all and drove to the beach, where she sat in her car watching waves crash against the rocks until the sun set. For the first time since discovering the affair, Grace allowed herself to truly feel the magnitude of what Victoria had done. Not just the betrayal of taking Walter, but the systematic destruction of everything Grace had built for herself. When her phone rang at 9 p.m., she almost didn't answer. James's name on the screen felt like salt in an open wound, another reminder of how thoroughly she'd been outplayed. They moved faster than I expected, he said without preamble when she finally picked up. You knew this would happen. I hoped we'd have more time to build our case. Grace, what did they offer you? She told him about the NDA, the severance, the threats. James was quiet for a long moment. If you sign that agreement, it's over. She wins completely. If I don't sign it, she destroys me anyway. Maybe. Or maybe we find another way to fight. Grace laughed bitterly. With what? She has surveillance photos, witness statements, legal representation. What do we have? We have something Victoria's never had to deal with before, James said quietly. We have each other. And Grace. We have something else she doesn't know about. What? Walter called me this afternoon. He wants to meet. Walter Morrison looked like he'd aged 5 years in 5 weeks. Grace found him waiting in the parking lot of their old gym at 6 a.m., sitting in his car with the engine running and his hands gripping the steering wheel like an anchor. He'd texted her at midnight, "We need to talk. Before you do anything you can't take back." Grace slid into the passenger seat of a car that still smelled like the pine air freshener he'd always preferred, still had their wedding photo tucked into the sun visor. For a moment, they sat in silence, two people who'd shared a life now strangers navigating the aftermath of its destruction. She's going to destroy you, Walter said finally, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. She already has. Grace, you don't understand. Victoria's not just trying to discredit you. She's planning to sue you for corporate espionage. She has documents that show you accessed client files after hours, printed strategy reports you had no business reviewing. Grace felt ice in her veins. I was working on those accounts. Of course I accessed the files. She had IT pull your access logs going back 6 months. She's building a narrative that you've been planning this theft for months, that the affair discovery was just your excuse to act on existing plans. The scope of Victoria's manipulation hit Grace like a physical blow. Every late night, every weekend strategy session, every moment of dedication had been documented and weaponized against her. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Walter finally looked at her, and Grace saw something she hadn't expected in his eyes. Guilt, yes, but also a kind of desperate regret that went deeper than the affair. Because I know what she did to James. I know how she systematically isolated him from their business partners, made him look unstable and unreliable until selling his shares was the only way to maintain his reputation. Walter's hands tightened on the wheel. She's doing the same thing to you, but worse. She's not just taking your job, she's taking your entire professional identity. So you do know who she really is. I've always known, Walter said quietly, and the admission hung between them like a confession. That was part of the attraction, if I'm being honest. Victoria sees what she wants and takes it. I've never been that decisive about anything in my life. Grace studied her husband's profile. This man she'd thought she knew completely. When did you decide you wanted her more than me? I didn't. The words came out strangled. Grace, I never wanted her more than you. But she made me believe I could be someone different. Someone more. And now? Walter laughed bitterly. Now I realize that someone more is actually someone less. Less loyal, less honest, less worthy of being loved. He turned to face her fully. Victoria doesn't love me, Grace. She collected me. And when she gets tired of this game, she'll discard me just like she did James. Grace felt something crack open in her chest. Not the sharp pain of betrayal, but something softer and more complicated. Pity, maybe. Or the ghost of old affection for the man Walter had been before Victoria's influence. There's something else, Walter continued. Something Victoria doesn't know I found. Financial irregularities in the agency's books. Client payments that don't match the reported amounts. She's been skimming, Grace. Not just a little, significant amounts over several years. Grace's mind raced. Financial fraud was serious, the kind of accusation that could bring down an entire agency if proven. Do you have proof? Walter reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. Bank records, client invoices, internal memos. Everything you'd need to show a pattern of systematic embezzlement. Grace stared at the small device that could change everything. Why are you giving this to me? Because I owe you something better than what I gave you. Because Victoria needs to be stopped before she destroys anyone else. Walter's voice broke slightly. And because maybe, if I help you take her down, I can live with myself again. Grace took the flash drive, feeling its weight like a promise. For the first time in weeks, she felt the stirring of something that might have been hope. Walter, when this is over, when Victoria's finished, what happens to us? Her husband looked out at the sunrise painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, colors that reminded Grace of better mornings when they'd shared coffee and crossword puzzles and dreams of growing old together. I don't know, he said honestly. I broke something between us that might not be fixable. But Grace, whoever you become after this, stronger, fiercer, more sure of your own worth, that person deserves someone who sees her value without having to be taught. Grace nodded, understanding. This was Walter's goodbye, his benediction, his final gift wrapped in an acceptance that some betrayals carved scars too deep for healing. She opened the car door, then paused. For what it's worth, I'm sorry Victoria couldn't see what I saw in you. The Walter I married was already enough. As she walked to her own car, Grace felt something settling in her chest. Not closure exactly, but a kind of clarity. The marriage was over, had been over from the moment Walter chose Victoria's vision of himself over the man Grace had loved. But the woman Grace was becoming didn't need his redemption to be whole. She had work to do. The Chen Marketing Solutions board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday in April, 6 weeks after Grace had been escorted from the building. She sat in the parking garage, hands steady on the steering wheel, watching Victoria's Porsche pull into the executive spot with its usual precision. Grace had spent those 6 weeks building an unbreakable case. The financial evidence Walter provided had been the foundation, but James's connections in the industry had helped her trace the full scope of Victoria's embezzlement. Client kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. Vendor contracts that existed only on paper while payments went to shell companies Victoria controlled. A systematic fraud that had netted her nearly $2 million over 4 years. But the financial evidence was just the beginning. Grace's real weapon was something Victoria had never seen coming. The network of people Victoria had discarded over the years, each carrying pieces of a larger pattern of manipulation and abuse. Sarah Kim, the account manager Victoria had driven to a nervous breakdown 2 years ago. Marcus Webb, the creative director who'd been blackballed from the industry after questioning one of Victoria's campaigns. Jennifer Liu, the junior associate who'd been sexually harassed by a client and found no support from Victoria when she reported it. Each of them had stories. Each of them had documentation Victoria thought was buried. And each of them was tired of being afraid. Grace walked into the conference room at exactly 2 p.m., flanked by James and the lawyer they'd retained, Maria Santos, a woman with a reputation for taking down corporate predators and the financial resources to wage war against well-funded opponents. Victoria's face showed only the slightest flicker of surprise before settling into its usual mask of professional calm. She sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the board members she'd carefully selected over the years, industry contacts who owed her favors, investors who cared more about returns than ethics. "Grace," Victoria said smoothly, "I'm surprised to see you here, given our recent discussions about your situation." "My situation has evolved," Grace replied, taking a seat directly across from Victoria. "As has my understanding of yours." Maria Santos opened her briefcase with deliberate ceremony. "Ms. Chen, my client is prepared to present evidence of systematic financial fraud, sexual harassment cover-ups, and violations of employment law spanning 4 years." Victoria's attorney, the same man who'd threatened Grace weeks earlier, leaned forward. "This is clearly a vindictive action by a disgruntled former employee. Ms. Morrison was terminated for cause and has demonstrated emotional instability." "Ms. Morrison was terminated as part of a pattern of retaliation against employees who might expose criminal activity," Maria interrupted smoothly. "We have documentation of similar treatment toward 12 other former employees, all of whom were dismissed shortly after gaining access to financial records or reporting inappropriate conduct." The next hour was a masterclass in controlled destruction. Maria laid out the financial evidence with surgical precision: bank records, forged invoices, the paper trail of Victoria's embezzlement. Then came the testimony from former employees, each describing the same pattern of manipulation, retaliation, and abuse. Grace watched Victoria's composure crack incrementally as the scope of the case became clear. This wasn't just about financial fraud. It was about a systematic pattern of predatory behavior that made Victoria legally and financially vulnerable on multiple fronts. "The district attorney's office has reviewed our evidence," Maria concluded. "They are prepared to file criminal charges if this matter isn't resolved to our satisfaction." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic far below. Victoria's board members exchanged glances that spoke volumes about shifting loyalties and self-preservation. Finally, Victoria spoke. "What do you want?" Grace leaned forward, feeling the weight of everyone she was fighting for, not just herself, but every person Victoria had tried to erase. Full restitution for stolen funds, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, your resignation from the company, and a fund to compensate the employees you've harmed over the years. "And if I refuse?" "Then you go to prison," Grace said simply. "And we make sure every client, every industry contact, every person who's ever trusted you knows exactly what you are." Victoria stared across the table at Grace for a long moment, and in her eyes, Grace saw something she'd never seen before: fear. Not the calculated concern of someone managing a difficult situation, but the raw terror of someone who finally understood they'd lost control. "You have no idea what you're doing," Victoria said quietly. "You think destroying me makes you stronger? You're about to learn that winning isn't the same as being happy." Grace smiled, and it felt like sunlight after a long winter. "Victoria, you never understood the most important thing about me. I was never trying to be like you. I was trying to be better than you." The settlement was finalized 3 days later. Victoria resigned in disgrace, her reputation in ruins, facing criminal charges that would likely result in prison time. The agency was restructured under new leadership, with James returning as creative director and several of Victoria's former victims hired into positions of authority. But Grace's real victory came the morning after the settlement, when she woke up in her apartment, not the house she'd shared with Walter, but a new space that belonged entirely to her, and realized she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Part 9. Satisfying conclusion. 6 months later, Grace stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new office, looking out over the city that had once seemed like Victoria's domain. Morrison Strategic was still small, just Grace, 2 junior associates, and a handful of freelance contractors. But it was growing steadily, built on relationships she'd nurtured over years of honest work. "The Hoffman Industries presentation is ready for your review," her assistant called from the outer office. Lisa Park was one of Victoria's former victims, a brilliant strategist who'd been pushed out for refusing to falsify market research data. Together, they were building something different, a company where success didn't require sacrificing integrity. Grace's phone buzzed with a text from James. "Dinner tonight? I have news about the Milan project." She smiled, typing back, 7 p.m. "Don't keep me in suspense." Her relationship with James had evolved slowly, carefully, with the patience of 2 people who understood what it meant to rebuild from ruins. They were partners now, in business, and slowly, tentatively, in something deeper. He understood her ambition without feeling threatened by it, supported her vision without trying to reshape it in his own image. It wasn't the easy love she'd had with Walter, built on shared routines and comfortable assumptions. This was something more complex, respect earned through adversity, trust built on mutual understanding of each other's scars, passion tempered by wisdom. The door chimed, and Grace looked up to see Walter standing in the reception area, looking uncertain and older than his years. She hadn't seen him since the settlement, though she'd heard through industry contacts that Victoria had discarded him as predicted, leaving him unemployed and professionally tainted by association. "Grace, I know I don't have the right to be here," he began as she approached. "But I wanted to see what you'd built. And to apologize, properly this time." She looked at this man who'd shared her bed for 5 years, who'd betrayed her trust and then helped her find her strength, and felt something like compassion stirring. "You look good," he said quietly. "Stronger. Like you found something you were looking for." "I found myself," Grace replied simply. "Or maybe I became someone I didn't know I could be." Walter nodded, understanding. "I'm glad. You deserved better than what I gave you. Better than what Victoria turned me into." "And you deserve better than what you settled for," Grace said, meaning it. "Walter, you're not the villain in this story. You were just another person Victoria manipulated. The difference is, you found your way back to who you really are." They talked for a few more minutes, about healing, about forgiveness, about the strange alchemy that sometimes transforms devastation into wisdom. When Walter left, Grace felt the final piece of her old life clicking into place, not as a wound but as a scar that had made her stronger. That evening, as she and James shared wine and talked about expansion plans and the future they were building together, Grace reflected on Victoria's parting words. "You think destroying me makes you stronger? You're about to learn that winning isn't the same as being happy." Victoria had been wrong about many things, but especially about this. Grace hadn't destroyed her enemy to become stronger. She'd discovered her own strength in the process of seeking justice. And happiness. Happiness had come not from revenge, but from the realization that she'd never needed Victoria's approval, Walter's devotion, or anyone else's permission to become extraordinary. She'd been extraordinary all along. She'd just needed to remember how to see it. Outside her window, the city sparkled with possibility, and Grace Morrison, entrepreneur, survivor, woman who'd learned to fight for herself, smiled and began planning her next move. Not revenge this time, but something better. A future built on her own terms, with people who saw her worth and never asked her to diminish it. Some love stories end with a kiss. Others end with a woman discovering she's strong enough to write her own ending. This one ended with both.